Hello and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. It's just 5 days since Rishi Sunak walked into Downing Street, apologising for mistakes made, promising a government of integrity and accountability. The Conservatives do seem to have stabilised in the polls, even making some progress on the economy. But the ongoing row over Suella Braverman's return to the Home Office threatens to overshadow his pledge. And there's an extraordinary story of Liz Truss's phone being hacked by Russia, raising fresh concerns over national security. All that as a fresh election looms in Northern Ireland, with little sign it could break the deadlock. A packed show ahead with our guests this morning. One of the more eye-catching appointments in Rishi Sunak's cabinet was the return of Michael Gove to his old department. We'll hear from the Levelling Up Secretary in just a moment. But it was the reappointment of Suella Braverman that caused the most controversy. The row rumbling on still. We'll be talking to the shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper. Plus, we've got two big exclusives from Northern Ireland on the programme this morning. The Northern Ireland Secretary says he will call elections there after 6 months of gridlock. I'll talk exclusively to Michelle O'Neill, the Vice President of Sinn Fein, First Minister-elect of the Stormont Assembly. We'll also have an exclusive interview with the DUP leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, on the programme. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine continues, with both sides digging in ahead of what could be a particularly grim winter. We'll talk to the Ukrainian MP, Inna Sobson, live from Kyiv. Plus, with Levelling Up back on the agenda, we'll talk to Susan Hinchcliffe, the leader of the council in Bradford. Hello, good morning. Well, could Levelling Up be back under Rishi Sunak? The new Prime Minister made a point of emphasising it as he entered Downing Street, but we know there are, in the words of the Chancellor, eye-wateringly difficult decisions on spending cuts ahead. So how do you level up if there's no money? And what's really been achieved in the 3 years since the big promises of the 2019 election? Well, I've been speaking to Michael Gove, who is now back for his second stint as Levelling Up Secretary. You've written in the Sun on Sunday today to say the Conservative Party owes the public an apology for installing Liz Truss as leader. So would you like to apologise?
Yes, I think we made a mistake. We took the wrong turn. The mini-budget, as I think everyone now recognises, contained a number of false steps. I think it was wrong to cut taxes for the wealthiest, and it was also wrong to proceed with tax cuts without saying how they were going to be paid for. And to be fair, Jeremy Hunt, as Chancellor, as soon as he was installed, made clear that those mistakes would have to be addressed. And Rishi Sunak, as Prime Minister, of course, has been vindicated. Some of the judgments that he made during the course of the summer, during the course of the leadership election, have been shown to be correct. And Rishi now, along with Jeremy and the rest of us in government, have some difficult decisions to take. But what we must do is be honest with the British people in order to regain trust.
Talking about regaining trust, there's a story in the Mail on Sunday today that Liz Truss's phone was hacked by the Kremlin. An astonishing story. Is it true?
Well, I don't know the details of it, and I do know that the government takes cyber security incredibly seriously.
Do you know if it's true or not? I suspect you might not know the details.
No, I don't know the full details. And so, again, the Mail on Sunday is a trusted newspaper, but I don't know the full details of what security breach, if any, took place. What I do know is that the government has very robust protocols in place in order to make sure that individuals are protected, but also that government security and national security are protected as well.
According to the story, they say that the Kremlin gained access to confidential exchanges, including about arms shipments to Ukraine, personal exchanges with the Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, and it's also reported that there was effectively a cover-up. You know, Boris Johnson and Simon Case, head of the civil service, agreeing to a news blackout. I mean, should Liz Truss have come clean if this was true? Well,
again, I'm sure that Liz, both as Foreign Secretary and as Prime Minister, will have followed the advice that she was given by the intelligence and security communities. I think all of us have to be sensitive, particularly those of us in government, to the fact that the more that we talk in detail about these things, the more that we risk giving information to people who wish this country and its citizens harm. So I'm sure that the right protocols were followed. I'm sure that more information, as appropriate, will be released.
I guess some people listening might be questioning, if this is, a government committed to national security, given that Suella Braverman, resigned after emailing these confidential papers from a personal email account to someone outside the government and also copying in the wrong person as well. A week later, she was back. you take a week off work if you've got the flu, not if you've committed a security breach. Should Rishi Sunak have appointed her?
Yes, we do take security issues incredibly seriously. That's why, again, I have to be cautious in responding to the point that you understandably made about Liz's phone. And it's because we take them seriously that we have strict protocols in place that govern how information should be shared and with whom it should be shared. Suella is a first-rate, front-rank politician. She acknowledged that a mistake had been made. She is working hard in order to ensure that our borders can be made more secure and that policing is more effective. And she's a valued member of the cabinet and someone whom I admire and like.
You say that she's an effective frontline politician, but there are reports in the Sunday Times today that she ignored legal advice that the government was illegally detaining thousands of asylum seekers at Manston Processing Centre in Kent. This is somewhere where people are only supposed to stay for 24 hours. There's a report of families being there for 4 weeks. Is that acceptable?
No, the situation in Manston is not what it should be. But again, it's important to stress that the Home Secretary did not ignore or dismiss legal advice. The Home Secretary was balancing a number of different competing imperatives. It's absolutely vital, of course, that we process people as quickly as possible. It's also important that we keep them in conditions which are humane. But
are they humane now, do you think?
Yes, but it is also the case that we're facing an unprecedented number of people arriving here who are smuggled into this country by criminal gangs, and the Home Secretary is focused both on making sure that we can break that criminal network and also that we can find appropriate accommodation for people as quickly as possible. It's
not appropriate, is it, in Manston, for families to stay for 4 weeks there? You acknowledge that?
Well, we want people to be in appropriate accommodation as quickly as possible. Well, the situation is not perfect. Everyone acknowledges that. We have more than 2,000 people there at the moment. But again, these are people who, having come to this country seeking asylum, when they're in Manston, their claims can be processed more quickly and more efficiently than was the case in the past. And in Manston, there are medical personnel, others who are trained in safeguarding, in order to make sure that people are treated in a humane and civilised manner. When it comes to finding appropriate accommodation for them to move on to, hotel or other accommodation, then that is costing the taxpayer a significant sum. It's important that we get that right. And one of the things that Suella was absolutely determined to do was to make sure that we balance all of the competing concerns.
I want to talk to you about levelling up.
Yes.
In 2019, you won an election on a manifesto that pledged to level up. Now, you've had 3 years to make progress on that, but the per-person spending gap between the North and London doubled between 2019 and 2021. That's according to the IPPPR. Bloomberg did a big data study about levelling up in June, and it found most places are going backwards. 21% of constituencies in the North West levelling up, 31% in the North East, only 4% in Yorkshire, 9% in the South West, none at all across the whole of the Midlands. I mean, why do you think you're going to make a bigger success of it this time than last time? Well,
the statistics that you've brought out are all powerful evidence of why it's more important than ever that we level up. Of course, the situation has become more difficult, partly as a result of COVID, partly as a result of inflation. But we won't succeed as a country unless we make sure that those parts of the United Kingdom that have been less productive, the North, the Midlands, the South West, are made more productive. And that requires, yes, investment, but it also requires much more than that. It requires giving local leaders the power to make a difference.
Do you acknowledge that you haven't done enough since that big promise in 2019 when many of them voted for you for the first time on that promise?
We've made progress, but it's not enough. You are absolutely right. So we can look at specific parts of the United Kingdom where progress has been made. If we look, for example, at Teesside and the example of Ben Hatcham, the mayor there, in the time that he's been elected, we've supported him to invest in the local economy, whether that's Teesside Airport or the new Teesworks site, which used to be the site of a steelworks, now the site of one of the biggest investments in renewables in the country. That is a change that is bringing high-value jobs to Teesside, and it's a change that's being driven by a Conservative mayor in partnership with the Conservative government.
Are investment zones still happening? They were a big Liz Truss push.
I'm reviewing them.
So potentially not?
We need to make sure that any change that we make is one which, of course, helps to support economic growth and good jobs for people in need, but also one of the concerns raised about investment zones was the impact on the environment. I've been very clear, and the Prime Minister has been very clear, that under no circumstances will we weaken environmental protections. So I will be looking with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, with the Environment Secretary and with the Prime Minister at the proposals that were drawn up when Liz was Prime Minister, and anything that might in any way undermine environmental protections is out.
On the environment, you, of course, have campaigned on green issues for many years now. But today, Alok Sharma, the government's climate change czar, has said that Rishi Sunak should go to COP27. That's the climate change summit that he says he's too busy with the autumn statement to attend. He's also said that the Conservatives will be punished at the election if you can row back from the environmental focus. Is he right?
Well, I think, first of all, Alok's done an amazing job as COP president. Secondly, our commitment to the environment is absolute and critical. Thirdly, when it comes to attendance at COP, I know that across government we want to field the strongest possible team at COP, but there are strong pressures on the Prime Minister's diary and on the pressures of others. Ultimately, I think when it comes to matters environmental, we'll be judged on what we deliver. We're the fastest decarbonising economy in the G7. There is much more to do, and we are doing it. So moving towards electric vehicles, making sure that we invest in renewables, and also critically making sure that we help nature to recover, both in the territory of the United Kingdom, but also in the oceans for which we're responsible.
If Rishi Sunak isn't attending the COP summit, why doesn't King Charles go?
Well, again, I think you entirely understand. I don't want to get drawn into details about what members of the royal family will do, where they should be, where they should go.
But it was clear advice from the government, wasn't it?
Well, again, I don't want to be... If you'll forgive me, I will avoid answering that question. I'll be upfront.
At least you're being upfront about it.
I will be upfront in avoiding answering that question because I don't want to be drawn into...
It's because you think he should go, that's
No. I don't want to be drawn into matters relating to where the king is, where he should go, and so on. For me, the particular approach I take towards these issues is that one shouldn't do that, but we will be fielding the strongest possible team at COP.
Now, I just want to play a video that might be familiar to... Well, I'm sure it's familiar to you, but potentially to our viewers as well. It's at hustings over the summer, where Rishi Sunak was filmed talking about taking money away from deprived inner-city areas. Let's just have a little watch.
I managed to start changing the funding formulas to make sure that areas like this are getting the funding that they deserve. Because we inherited a bunch of formulas from the Labour Party that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas, then that needed to be undone. I started the work of undoing that.
So he's talking there about undoing the work of, as he calls it, shoving funding into deprived urban areas. And I know that you'll say, look, there is rural poverty too. I agree with you on that. But, he's not talking about, some parts of Cornwall or Lincolnshire where there is rural deprivation. He was talking Tunbridge Wells. That's 273rd out of 317 in the index of deprivation. Is that someone serious about levelling up?
Yes, because he was responding directly to a question from someone from Thanet. You'll be aware that that part of North East Kent is one of the most deprived parts of the South East, that communities in Margate and Ramsgate, even though there's been welcome investment there recently, do face deprivation, poor housing, there are a number of social ills there. He was directly addressing that point, and the Prime Minister has made clear, of course, there is deprivation in our big cities that we need to address, but there is also rural and coastal deprivation, which does need to be addressed as well. And levelling up, of course, needs to be focused on the North and the Midlands, but somewhere like Thanet is definitely an area that requires government attention in order to improve the outcomes for people there.
OK. Now, you did an interview with the Financial Times in October. This is before, of course, you had your big comeback, if you like, to the Cabinet.
Yes.
You said this about Brexit. I was quite interested in this. You said, I asked myself all the time, was it the right thing to do? I still think that it was right, but that doesn't mean that a choice as momentous as this doesn't require you from time to time to think, what are the downsides? Has it turned out in the way you might have imagined? What lessons can you learn? And I'm actually very interested to know your answer to some of the questions you posed. What are the downsides, do you think?
Well, I think it's important to look at a big question like Brexit and to recognise that you can't make a snap judgment a few years later and say definitively that everything, as a result of leaving the European Union, has gone precisely in a perfect way. I think, on balance, Brexit has been a significant success for this country, but I do acknowledge that there have been frictions. And my friend Steve Baker, for example, acknowledged that as we resolve the situation in Northern Ireland, that some of the things that have been said and done haven't necessarily been perfectly pitched. I think that is an example of something that we need to address. But overall, I think we wouldn't have had the vaccine rollout, that was so successful if we'd been within the European Union. And in an area for which I was previously responsible in the environment, we wouldn't have a better method of supporting farmers that strengthens the environment as well as enhancing food production if we were in the Common Agricultural Policy. And in my own area, there are opportunities now that the Prime Minister is exploring to change the way in which some of the big funds, the pension funds, invest, which will mean that more money can go into levelling up areas. Those are three big benefits of Brexit.
You talk about the challenges with Northern Ireland, and I think many people would agree that it's perhaps the biggest challenge of Brexit. We'll be talking about that later on the programme as well. Geoffrey Donaldson of the DUP telling Sky News another election won't break the deadlock and the UK actually needs to focus on negotiations with the EU over the Brexit protocol. Is he right?
Well, we do need to focus on negotiations. Sir Geoffrey is a friend, and I think that I would say to him and to all the parties in Northern Ireland that we're in a stronger position to deliver for the people of Northern Ireland if all the parties get back into the executive. That is what the Northern Ireland Secretary and the Prime Minister have consistently said. We also need to negotiate with the European Union in order to find a way through. And again, to be fair, figures from Tony Blair to those in the Irish government and indeed those in the EU have acknowledged that the protocol isn't working in its current form and it needs to be fixed.
Was, going back to kind of your sort of Brexit thoughts, was the situation in Northern Ireland more difficult than you expected?
Well, I certainly thought that there would be challenges. I think one of the issues here, and I don't want to sort of, put the blame on anyone particularly, but I do think, in retrospect, the way in which the European Union insisted on the protocol as a means of resolving the issues in Northern Ireland, the way in which they did so was overly legalistic, and didn't take account of the reality on the ground.
You signed up to the protocol and Boris Johnson said it was a great deal, though.
Well, again, the protocol was supposed to be a sort of living instrument. I sat on a committee that was explicitly designed to make sure that the protocol worked effectively. And one of the things that I said to people in the EU is, you are trying to apply the protocol in a way which will mean that it will not work effectively. There has, I'm not claiming any great sort of insight, but the arguments that I was putting and that Boris was putting to the EU at the time have been vindicated.
OK, now, just a couple of things to finish. You've prepped Rishi Sunak for his first Prime Minister's question. You're involved in that. You also, of course, were involved in the PMQ's preparation for Boris Johnson, David Cameron. How do they all compare? I'm fascinated.
Well, obviously, the public will make the judgment there. I think that Rishi did brilliantly in his first...
in the preparation?
Yes.
Because everyone has different ways, don't they, of preparing for PMQs. I was wondering if, we know that Rishi Sunak's quite partial to a can of Coke. Did you have any particular ways of preparing?
Well, again, that morning we had Cabinet and then we discussed some of the questions that might come up at Prime Minister's Question Time. Rishi is, as you would expect, he's formidably well briefed. There wasn't an issue that was likely to come up which he didn't, have the full background on. And also, look, this was one of the first occasions on which the public were seeing him as Prime Minister. The thing that struck me is that he was, cool and unflappable beforehand. I'm sure, like football players, every Prime Minister will have a ritual immediately beforehand. I know that David Cameron used to have a cup of tea with 3 or 4 sugars in just to give him that extra burst. I know that when Boris was Prime Minister, he liked to have one of the team in number 10 play Keir Starmer, and so there were 2 particular aides who at different times played Keir Starmer. Rishi likes to look at it issue by issue by issue in a very methodical way.
Does someone play Keir Starmer for Rishi Sunak as well?
There is one incredibly bright person who ran through the questions that Keir Starmer might run. I will spare the blushes of that person, simply to say that she's one of the smartest people I've ever worked with.
OK, very interesting to know that. You've had a bit of a comeback as well, haven't you? Were you expecting to be back in Cabinet?
No.
Does this mean we're going to be seeing a bit less of you in the nightclubs?
Yes.
OK, thank you very much indeed.
No, not at all. Thanks, Eve. Thank you.
Michael Gove there, Levelling Up Secretary. Now, we were talking an awful lot about security issues in that interview, and Labour says it will try to use parliamentary tactics to force the government to disclose any security assessments of the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, before she was reappointed by the Prime Minister. Now, that, of course, was just 6 days after she resigned for breaking the ministerial code. Well, we can talk now to Labour's Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, who joins us now live. Before we get to Braverman, I'm interested in the story, extraordinary story, on the front page of the Mail about Liz Truss's phone reportedly being compromised. Now, Michael Gove said he wasn't across the details in the interview earlier, but what is your response to these allegations?
Well, clearly these are very serious allegations. It raises issues around cybersecurity. It's why cybersecurity has to be taken so seriously by everyone across government, at the role of hostile states, but also the allegations about whether a cabinet minister has been using a personal phone for serious government business, and serious questions about why this information or this story has been leaked or briefed right now. And all of these, I think, just go to the heart of this, raising questions about the way in which the government is not taking seriously enough national security. And of course, the serious problem is the person who ought to be providing reassurance that the government has a grip, the person who ought to be doing interviews this morning about all of this is the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, and she can't do that because she's still unable to answer those serious questions about her own security breaches and lapses. And that's why I think this is a problem really for Rishi Sunak, not simply the story this morning about Liz Truss.
You say about questions about why it was leaked now. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's just a question about why this story, which obviously has implications for national security itself, is now being briefed or been leaked today as well. So as well as the actual events that have taken place, I think it's really just important that I really hope that this hasn't been leaked, for example, to try and distract from some of the other things that are happening, because obviously I think actually it does the opposite and just raises wider concerns about the way in which the government is not taking seriously enough these issues around national security.
You, of course, have been very strong in calling for more information about what happened with Suella Braverman. She resigned, of course, after emailing those papers from a personal email account. What exactly are you calling for?
Excuse me, just putting an umbrella up, Sophie. It's getting quite wet here.
Thanks for battling
So
weather.
we think that we have to have proper answers about whether or not this was the first security breach from Suella Braverman. We think that the papers and the warnings that were provided by the Cabinet Office and by the Cabinet Secretary to the Prime Minister should be sent to the Intelligence and Security Committee. So far, we have been asking repeatedly whether the Home Secretary has used her personal phone to send other government documents. There's also questions about whether she was investigated for other security leaks, including around a case involving the security service and around a case involving sensitive legal advice around Northern Ireland. Now, this is just irresponsible. You can't have a Home Secretary who is not trusted by the security service, who is not trusted with important government information. And it really shows the huge error of judgment that Rishi Sunak has made in reappointing someone just 6 days after she broke the ministerial code over security lapses, reappointing her to this immensely serious position. National security is too important for this kind of chaos, confusion and really irresponsible decision-making.
Now, there are reports in the Sunday Times that Suella Braverman ignored the legal advice that the government was illegally detaining thousands of asylum seekers at Manston Processing Centre in Kent. Michael Gove acknowledged to us on the programme earlier that it's not good enough, that more needs to be done. What exactly should happen to those families, do you think, and how much would it cost, given the premium that Labour is putting on making sure everything you're announcing is fully costed?
There is an immediate action that the Home Secretary needs to take to make sure that the Home Office is compliant with the law, to make sure that you don't have the kinds of shocking conditions that the inspector has described, with an Afghan family in a marquee for 32 days and overcrowding that appears to have led to a diphtheria outbreak in the UK. as a result of the Home Office not responding properly. But look, there is a wider issue here, that this is a result of the collapse in asylum decision-making. They're only taking half the number of asylum decisions that they were taking 5 or 6 years ago. That has led to a huge backlog. And of course, a failure to have a proper deal and agreement in place with France, or to crack down on the criminal gangs, so we're not preventing a lot of these dangerous boat crossings in the first place. And really the irresponsible issue is that government is still pursuing spending £140 million now on a Rwanda deal that the Home Secretary herself has admitted is failing. That money, it should be cut and put into cracking down on the criminal gangs instead, and that would help address some of these problems.
It's difficult, though, isn't it? Because I know, as you will acknowledge, there are record numbers of small boats crossing the Channel. Everyone is grappling to try and find a way out of this. And, people have talked about cracking down on the criminal gangs before. It's not that easy, though, is it? If it was that easy, everyone would just click their fingers and do it.
Nothing is easy in this, but there hasn't been a serious strategy to tackle the criminal gangs. We've seen a huge proliferation. They've effectively created a multi-million-pound criminal industry on the Channel over the last few years. This has increased very dramatically just over the last few years.
So what
and there hasn't been enough action by both French and British authorities to deal with it. So I think what you need, we've proposed a new cell, an elite unit as part of the National Crime Agency with hundreds of specialist officers to work with Europol, with the French authorities, to actually crack down on those criminal gangs and to get some prosecutions. We've seen in other areas of serious organised crime, when there have been substantial prosecutions, it has had an impact on the whole network. At the moment, for many of these criminal gangs, they see this as a cost-free crime because the costs and the risks are in people's lives being put at risk in the Channel, and that is what is so dangerous, and that's where they should be cracking down. The government instead has spent another £20 million just in the last 3 months on the Rwanda deal, which is actually in danger of increasing trafficking and increasing that criminal gang activity. That's been the evidence from other countries. So that's on top of the £120 million they've already spent. So I think that they are focusing on headlines rather than the hard work that's actually needed to tackle this problem.
Just finally, because you are, I can see, battling with the rain, which we do appreciate, of course. And I want to start this question by acknowledging that Labour is still very, very clearly ahead in the polls. But according to opinion, there are some issues the government has regained a lead over, with a 4-point lead on Labour on the economy, a 7-point lead on defence, a 5-point lead on dealing with terrorism. Do you think Rishi Sunak is more formidable opposition than Liz Truss?
I think he is part of 12 years of Conservative government that has caused deep damage to this country. We saw, obviously, the huge damage done by the mini-budget, the chaotic, huge unfunded cuts in taxes for the richest people in the country that has done permanent damage, and people are now paying higher mortgages as a result of what's happened. But the one thing I did agree with Liz Truss on is when she described the 12 years of failed growth under the Conservatives. They've had one sort of growth experiment after another that has not worked because they still ultimately see this as a sort of trickle-down approach, which is really damaging. Labour set out an alternative plan. You've heard from Keir Starmer and from Rachel Reeves, a serious green prosperity plan, a way to grow the economy that I know you've had the Tesco's chair on talking about, and the important benefits that has for the country and for growing the economy as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Yvette Cooper. I think you might need a new umbrella, by the way.
No, I think I might. No.
Good to have you on the programme today. Yvette Cooper there, battling with the rain. And now let's turn to Northern Ireland, shall we? The Secretary of State, Chris Heaton-Harris, plans to call a new election after the deadline for power sharing passed without agreement. DUP leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson says another Assembly election will not break the deadlock and restore devolved government at Stormont. But Sir Geoffrey says there's been 3 Prime Ministers since the last Stormont election and chaos at times in Westminster. So he wants the government to focus on negotiations with the EU over the Brexit protocol instead of calling an election. He's been speaking to our senior Ireland correspondent, David Blevins, exclusively for this programme.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, the DUP won't restore power sharing, and the UK government doesn't seem to know if it wants an election in Northern Ireland or not. Surely the people of Northern Ireland deserve better governance than this?
Well, indeed, we want to see Stormont restored as soon as possible. And actually, I don't think an election takes us closer to a solution. So why not use the next few weeks to double down on getting either a negotiated solution with the European Union or bringing forward the legislation in Parliament that will resolve the issues around the Northern Ireland Protocol.
But given that we're now 6 months past the Assembly election, there is no devolved government, is the Northern Ireland Secretary not legislatively obliged to call an election?
Well, let's look what has happened in those 6 months since the Assembly election. We've had 3 Prime Ministers. Westminster at times has been in chaos. There's been little focus on getting a solution to the protocol. The talks with the EU only started again a couple of weeks ago, and even then only at a technical level, not at a political level.
How is it easier to resolve the problems around the protocol outside of the power-sharing government rather than inside, working together to find a solution?
Well, of course, David, we tried that for over 2 years. We tried to get a solution on the protocol, and we worked with the other parties. We pressed the government to take action, and the EU simply said no. There will be no renegotiation of the protocol. And it reached a point where our ministers in Stormont were required to impose measures on the people of Northern Ireland as a result of the protocol that every single day was harming our economy, our businesses, driving up the cost of living for households. 25% tariffs on steel products coming from Birmingham to Belfast. That is ridiculous.
You say the EU says no. The DUP says no to power sharing, says no to the protocol, said no to Theresa May's backstop option. Are you at the point where the DUP regrets saying yes to Brexit in the first place?
Well, we say yes to power sharing, but it has to be on the basis of mutual respect. It has to be on the basis of adhering to the principles of the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement. And at the heart of that agreement is that Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. That was even accepted by the Irish government, who changed their constitution to recognise Northern Ireland as part of the UK. The protocol has cut across that. We never supported the protocol. We made clear it would harm Northern Ireland, it would create instability, and so it has. And I welcome the commitment now of the EU to negotiate a new solution. I welcome the fact that the EU is now at the negotiating table. Why is that, David? It's because of the pressure we have put on. It's because of the steps the DUP has taken that finally we're getting a negotiation, a proper negotiation on finding a solution to this problem. That's what I've asked for, and now we need to see that solution coming forward, and frankly, the sooner the better.
Is Rishi Sunak the DUP's worst nightmare because he clearly doesn't want a trade war with the EU and therefore isn't going to tear up the protocol?
Well, look, I don't want a trade war with the EU. I want to trade with the EU, but I fundamentally want the ability to trade within my own country. And that is what the protocol denies us. And look, whoever is the Prime Minister in Westminster, I have to work with them. I have to work with the government, and I will. I am absolutely committed every single day to working to find this solution. And I will work with Rishi Sunak to get that solution. And all I ask of the government is that the objectives that they have outlined in the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which is currently before Parliament, are the objectives that they pursue in the negotiations. Liz Truss gave us that commitment. Rishi Sunak has also stated that he wants to achieve the same objectives. So let's get on with it. Let's get this solution. Let's see the negotiations and the tempo of those negotiations increased so that we get to an outcome that unionists can support.
The refusal to restore power sharing, is it really about the protocol, or is it about the fact that Sinn Féin's Michelle O'Neill is on course to become the first nationalist First Minister?
Well, look, my party is the Democratic Unionist Party. That means, first of all, we accept the outcome of the election. But let's not forget, David, I withdrew my ministers from the executive, or the First Minister, back in February, well before the election. I signalled way back in September last year the actions that we would take if a solution was not found on the protocol. So this is not to do with who is the first or deputy First Minister. This is about the second part of what my party stands for, the union. It is about unionists feeling that they have been made second-class citizens as a result of a protocol that diminishes and undermines our place in the United Kingdom. That's what we need to resolve. and I'm focused on getting a solution. And when we get that solution, I am absolutely clear the DUP will be back in government doing our bit to build a better future for everyone in Northern Ireland.
Every time unionism has pulled out of government, it has ended up in a worse situation. If there is no deal to restore power sharing at the end of all of this, what is the alternative? Surely we can't just be looking at a return to direct rule from Westminster after all these years.
I'm not prepared to accept failure. I'm going to work for success. I'm going to work for a solution. And every single day, I'm going to be at Westminster or at Stormont or in Brussels, wherever I need to be to press for that solution, because we need that for Northern Ireland. We need stability. We've got a cost of living crisis. There are many issues we need to be addressing. I want to see a fully functioning devolved government again in Northern Ireland. So that's what I'm working towards, David. I'm not prepared to accept that there won't be an outcome to this. I've often said before, and I say it again, when I look at the last 25 years in Northern Ireland, the mountains we have climbed to build peace and stability are far higher than the mountains in front of us.
But given that unionism no longer holds sway to the extent it once did, is joint authority, London and Dublin, governing Northern Ireland, not a realistic possibility?
Well, it is certainly not part of the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement. The UK government have made clear joint authority is not an option. I think joint authority, and even talk of joint authority, David, I think is reckless. I think it raises tension at a time when what we all need to do is focus on getting a solution, and joint authority is no solution.
Thank you very much.
Well, that was the Democratic Unionist Party leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, talking to David Blevins for this programme. Let's turn now to Sinn Fein and the party's Vice President, Michelle O'Neill, who would have become the first minister after the party topped the last elections earlier this year. Thank you so much for being on the programme for us today. We just heard from Sir Geoffrey saying that Northern Ireland doesn't need an election. What it needs is better negotiations and sorting out the Brexit protocol. Do you think that there needs to be an election?
Good morning, Sophie. Well, firstly, we did have an election. We had an election back in May last year. And I think that certainly my party and other parties were given a very strong mandate in which to form a government, actually to support people through what is one of the most challenging times I think that most people have been through in terms of the cost of living crisis. But the outcome of that election is continually being denied by the DUP and by Geoffrey Donaldson. They have failed to accept the outcome of that election. They've failed to form a government, and they've failed to work with the rest of us to get people through these times. So, we shouldn't have to have an election because we have had one. But unfortunately, that election result is being disrespected. Now, what we have at this current moment in time is 6 months post that election. We have a state of limbo. We've no government in place. We've no ministers in post. We've nobody taking decisions in the interests of the people. And it's just not acceptable. It's just not good enough.
What's the difference between the DUP collapsing Stormont over something as fundamental as what they see as the constitutional question, and Sinn Féin pulling it down for 3 years over a botched green energy scheme?
Well, it was a financial scandal, actually, that the DUP designed and delivered. It was a scandal that would have saw the public purse hit for £500 million. I don't think any government anywhere in the world would have withstood such a scandal. But I also think that at that time, whenever it did collapse, we worked every day to try to put it back together again. But the DUP ran over to London to prop up the Tories and therefore weren't interested in actually establishing government at home. So I think that's regrettable in that sense. But, I think where we are today is that the public rightly deserve, sensible, mature political leaders working together to try to form a government, to actually start to put money into their pockets to get them through the cost of living crisis. And unfortunately, that is not the case. And we're caught up in the midst of all of this mess, chaos, dysfunction, heartlessness, if you like, of the Tories in London. And the DUP are on towards those people instead of actually run towards the people at home who actually want politics to work. I just think that as we enter into next year, which will mark 25 years of our peace process, 25 years of our remarkable journey of transformation in our society. And I think it's just such a shame that we're sitting in a scenario today in political limbo where the public are being denied access to democracy and their votes. But the DUP are telling people right now their votes don't count. The election that they voted for and they voted in May of this year is being disrespected. And I just don't think that's good enough.
You said that the DUP, in your view, I'm sure that they would disagree, not interested in forming a government. If you believe that, do you think it's partly because they are uncomfortable with effectively power sharing with, a Sinn Féin First Minister?
Yes, I don't think it's lost on the wider public out there that the DUP don't like the May election result. I don't think it's lost on the wider public that they have difficulty in forming a government to be a Deputy First Minister to my mandate, which is to be the First Minister, given the recent election results. So I think it's not lost on people that that's actually the real motivation here. But the DUP hide behind the issues of the protocol. They hide behind all of that. So what I want to see in the time ahead is very mature, sensible political discussion between both the British government and the EU side. Let's find an agreed way to solve the issues around the protocol. And I would make this case again to disagree with Jeffrey Donaldson and the DUP. The protocol is a necessity and it's here to stay. There are things that can be smoothed out. There are things that can be made to work better. And I'm up for that. And I hope that's what we achieve in the coming weeks and months. There has been a renewed focus, if you like, between both the British government and the EU side to get to have discussions in terms of making the protocol work. And I urge that to continue in earnest and actually to be ramped up and actually find an agreed way forward, because the certainty and stability that will bring will do two things. It will provide that certainty and stability. It would allow us to be able to look towards investment opportunities. But second to that, then it'll remove any pretense from the DUP in terms of forming an executive with myself and with the rest of the parties.
The collapsed institutions are, about the protocol, but I think, as you probably acknowledge, also about, a lack of trust across the divide. In a recent interview, you said this: I don't think any Irish person ever woke up one morning and thought that conflict was a good idea, but the war came to Ireland. I think at the time there was no alternative, but now, thankfully, we have an alternative to conflict, and that is the Good Friday Agreement. By saying that there was no alternative to the violence that we've seen from the IRA during the Troubles, are you not worried that you're adding to some of that distrust? How will that persuade unionists that you can be a First Minister for all?
Well, the public had given me a mandate to be First Minister for all. That's what I said that I wanted to be. But I think that you have to realise that we have been a society that has been absolutely transformed over the course of the last 25 years, and our precious peace process has to be held on to with everything we've got. Unfortunately, this Tory government care less for our peace process, and I think Brexit is a good case in point. Brexit and the Good Friday Agreement were never going to be compatible. But I think that, there's no doubt that we've had a very difficult past. There's no doubt that people have been hurt across the piece, across all of our community. And all of my adult life has been about building the peace. But if we're going to truly reconcile our people, if we're going to truly look towards the future, and if we're going to unburden today's young people of the past, then we need to properly deal with the past, not just to acknowledge that there are different narratives of the past. People have very different lived experiences. And we have to, most importantly, ensure that those conditions never, ever exist again. So for me, this is about looking towards the future as opposed to looking towards the past, but we have to absolutely deal with the past. And the approach of this Tory government to, for example, bring forward this bill in terms of dealing with the past is absolutely shameful and shambolic. And it is not there's no political support for the legislation that they're bringing through Westminster in terms of an amnesty. There's no political support from any political quarter, from any of the victims and survivors groups. So how are we going to look towards the future if we don't properly and adequately deal with the past?
You're talking there about the Tory government. So I am interested to finally just get your view on Rishi Sunak, the new Prime Minister. Also, of course, we've seen Chris Heaton-Harris reappointed as Northern Ireland Secretary. Do you welcome those two appointments, or do you have any concerns?
Well, Sophie, I look forward to the day whenever there isn't any interference in terms from the British government in terms of the Irish people's affairs here. However, this is the scenario that we find ourselves in today. But there's no doubt that the Tory party don't care less for the Good Friday Agreement. They certainly don't care for the people. They're not acting in the interests of anybody. The past 3 months has been about self-serving agenda, about staying in power. And I think that the policy decisions of the Tories really make people's lives much, much more difficult every day. The events of recent weeks and months have demonstrated that. But for now, the British government are a co-guarantor of our peace agreement, and my interest is the interest of the people here. So I will work with them. I encourage the new British Prime Minister to continue to work with the EU to ramp up those discussions, find ways to smooth out the protocol, make it work and get it bedded down and bring that certainty and stability that the people here deserve.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Michelle O'Neill there. Now, the war in Ukraine is entering yet another grim phase as a cold winter approaches. Russia has now deployed tens of thousands of reservists, but Ukraine continues to push to retake ground, especially in the south. Meanwhile, Russia has suspended a deal that allows the export of grain following attacks on its fleet. Well, we can talk now to the Ukrainian MP, Inna Sobson, who joins us now live from Kyiv. Thank you so much for being on the programme, particularly from where you're coming from in Kyiv. We're very grateful to have you. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Kyiv was targeted by Russian missiles for the first time in months. What was that like for you and your family?
Well, the first day of the attack, I was about to take my son to school, and that didn't work out well. So we actually ended up in the underground station for 3.5 hours with thousands of other people who were trying to find shelter over there. Then the attacks continued on the next couple of days up to this week. And I think people calmed down a little bit about it. So, people are still trying to find shelter, but there were not big hits after that in the city. The major change that did affect the lives of the civilian population was, of course, that the energy infrastructure was hit very badly. And we were having blackouts from time to time. But yesterday was actually the first day when I didn't have when I had electricity during the whole day at my home. So I think some things got fixed, so it's better to an extent possible.
Certainly. I can imagine it must be just the uncertainty of where you are and going through something where you live in Kyiv with your son must have been very difficult indeed. I believe, after the bombing, you and your son went to the metro station to shelter. What was it like? How did you find it?
Well, it was not very easy because my son is 10, and at some point when we were gathering our stuff at home and I was telling him that we're going to the underground station, he looked at me and he said, "Mom, am I going to die?" And I had to be very calm and to say, "No, I'm doing my best to protect you. But trust me, this is not the question you want to be answering to your kid at any point of time." And then when we were rushing to the metro station, he looked at me again and said, "Mom, is those bombs that we're hearing, are those the nuclear bombs or the regular ones?" And I said, "Well, those are the regular ones. Why are you asking?" And he looked at me rather proudly and he said, "Because I know what to do in case of the nuclear attack, because that is what we learned at school." And that is, again, something you never want to hear from your child. But he was rather calm and he said, "Yeah, we had instructions about what to do, so I will tell you what to do in case you forgot." Again, not a conversation you want to be having, but part of our daily life here. But inside the metro station, people were actually rather calm. People knew what to do. People got their stuff. They got something to sit on. They got water. They got medicines and all of that. Yeah, exactly what you are seeing right now. I think that's actually a video from my Twitter. You can see that people were, rather calm. And I would hear people calling their relatives, their loved ones, saying, "Yeah, we're fine. As soon as this is over, we'll go back to work." Nobody was saying that we have to flee, we have to run away, we have to get away from Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And actually, the amazing thing is that according to our border agency, they said that actually the number of people who left the country in the last couple of weeks after those attacks on big cities started has actually decreased. So people are not running away.
Wow. I have to say, your son sounds pretty incredible in that situation to be saying, "Don't worry, I know what to do if there's a nuclear bomb." That resilience, absolutely extraordinary stuff. Your boyfriend, I think, is fighting with the Ukrainian forces. Have you managed to stay in touch with him?
We do, to an extent possible. Sometimes it just, sending a text to him asking if he's okay, and he says, "I'm okay," which is good enough for me. He's actually in Kyiv today for 1 day, so that's great. It's the first time in 3 months, I guess. Other than that, he spends most of his time over there in the battlefront. He's a military medic, so he's helping people right there on the battlefront.
Thank you for doing this interview. If your boyfriend is in Kyiv today, after fighting, on the front line, makes us even more grateful that you're giving up the time to talk to us. Given that, let's try and get your message out there as much as possible. The UK's new Prime Minister had a call with President Zelensky this week. Are you confident that Rishi Sunak will be as great an ally as Boris Johnson was?
Well, actually, one of the reasons I continue doing this, despite Sasha, my boyfriend, being here in Kiev, is because my job is, well, he is fighting on the battlefront. My job is to continue fighting on the diplomatic front as a member of parliament. So that is what I'm continuing to do. And of course, Britain is a crucially important partner for all of us. We have been extremely grateful for the support we have received from the United Kingdom, and we do hope that it will continue. And the fact that the new Prime Minister already talked to our president is reassuring. So we do hope that the internal situation in the UK will stabilize and that support will actually continue. We very much wait for Mr. Sunak to come over here to Kiev. A bit of a fun stuff around here. There is a famous bakery in Kiev which has made a bakery thingy, which was called Boris Johnson, because we were so much a fan of the previous Prime Minister. And they have already made a new one called Rishi Sunak. So he really should come because he's very much awaited here in Kiev, and we very much hope that this support will continue and will actually grow, because there are still some things that we are not getting from our Western partners, particularly the tanks. That is something that we need to be talking about, because that is what our military guys on the battlefront need very much. And we hope that the new Prime Minister will be pushing for that as well.
Talking about the international response, it feels like there may be some cracks forming in what has been up till now quite a united response from the United States, with some calling on President Biden to push harder for peace talks. Are you concerned about the US?
I am a bit concerned. I'm actually traveling to the US at the end of this week, and I do hope to understand the internal situation a bit better. Of course, we are a bit concerned about the elections coming up in the United States. We do hope they will not change the willingness of the current administration to help Ukraine. But yeah, we are concerned, and we do hope that after all, what will be clear to the politicians in DC or in London is that we are working together because of our shared interests, and our shared interest is to contain authoritarianism in the world. So those shared interests do not change because of the electoral results, and we hope that will be clear to everyone else.
Thank you so much for being with us today, talking about your own experiences and what the West needs to do. And also, I do really hope that you get to spend a bit of time with your boyfriend today as well. So I'm going to let you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
They're always absolutely extraordinary, the interviews coming out of Ukraine. We're definitely going to commit to keep doing them on this programme. Well, we can return now to levelling up. Earlier, of course, in the programme, Michael Gove said that there has been progress, but there is much more to do. Now, Bradford is often held up as a prime example of somewhere that could benefit from levelling up, but of course it remains one of the most deprived places in the country, with quite poor transport links in particular. Well, Bradford City Council leader Susan Hinchcliffe joins us now. Thank you very much for being with us. Are you pleased to see Michael Gove back in his job as Levelling Up Secretary?
So generally, I think amongst the mayors and local authority leaders, we're pleased to see somebody who's got a bit of clout, a bit of government experience, who wants to get things done, because that's what we really need. We need the levelling up not just to be the domain of one government department. They need to be able to influence the Department of Transport, Department of Health, and of course, importantly, the Treasury, to enable us to get things done and to grow our economy locally.
Now, Bradford is the 13th most deprived local authority in the whole of England, so obviously a prime candidate for levelling up. They've had 3 years, the Conservatives, since the 2019 election, when they were elected on the mandate for levelling up. How's it gone so far?
So, obviously, like the rest of the nation, Bradford is struggling in terms of rising costs of inflation, as budgetary guidelines with 45 million as gap this year. 33 million of that is inflation, and that's in common with a lot of other local authorities around the country. We really do need that gap funding, because otherwise we won't be able to develop and grow our economies. So far, obviously, like the rest of the nation, it's been a very bumpy ride, but we believe in our place. We're the youngest city in the UK here, 140,000 children in school. We're going to be a city of culture in 2025. We're investing here, and I need a government that also believes in investing alongside us, because we need that station. As you say, we've got poor transport links. We need to be connected to the mainline railway and make sure we can get to Manchester more easily as well as Leeds. And that requires an investment by government for a new station, but it's something that all the Northern leaders agree on, and actually the Transport Select Committee agree on. So let's get that done. So it's things like that we need a really more proactive conversation with government about. We're hoping Michael Gove can help us open doors.
Let's talk a bit about transport, shall we? Because obviously the city does have a particular issue when it comes to transport. Now, Liz Truss said that she would build Northern Powerhouse Rail in full, including that crucial station in Bradford, reversing a decision to scrap it that was taken by the previous administration, which, of course, Michael Gove was a part of. Are you worried that, given the cost pressures this government is now facing, they might go back on the Liz Truss plan?
I don't think they can afford to go back on it, to be quite honest. If we're really serious about growing our economy, we have to invest in our transport, in our skills, in our culture actually as well, which I say City of Culture is important for us. But if you don't invest in your human capital post-Brexit, we are not actually going to succeed as a nation. So it's really important to invest in young people, get them into colleges, get them into good jobs so they can create a good income for themselves and their family going forward. We cannot afford levels of poverty in this country that is being seen. And, you know, at the moment, £1 in £5 from government is spent on alleviating poverty. We need to spend it more wisely to make sure we can get up front of that and actually invest in growth and make sure people have a good income going forward. So I believe in what we've got here as a plan. We know the station would create another 27,000 more jobs. It would create another 3 billion GVA over a 10-year period. Why would any government say no to that, whoever is in charge? And that's the case we're making strongly, and that we see others are also coming alongside.
You say you want to invest in growth. I mean, that's what Liz Truss tried to do, isn't it? Didn't go so great for her.
No, absolutely. And obviously, we don't deal with taxation to that level of local government. For us, it's about investing in things like One City Park, like the new markets we're doing, like Bradford Live, 4,000-seater live music venue. But to be able to do that, we do need to be able to fund the people who deliver those projects for us. So coming forward to the next financial statements that the Treasury is going to make, we need to see that they're going to fund local authorities to keep delivering, because we're delivering growth at local level. We are the arms of government who can actually deliver that growth, and if we're not funded to do so, all we do is spend all our time trying to cut back services, and that's not good for the public we serve or for the ambitious growth that the government says they've got. We want to be part of a growth plan, and we think we can help deliver that.
There was a study done by Bloomberg in June this year where they looked at how levelling up was going, and they said that public spending is actually increasing in constituencies around London and actually in the rest of the UK, so in the north of England, it's actually falling back compared to 2019 levels. The IPPR think tank as well says that between 2010 and 2020, just £349 was spent per person on transport in the north, £864 per person in London. Do you think that there is, I guess, a bias in Westminster against places outside London?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier in the programme about Rishi Sunak and in his what he said in Tunbridge Wells, and that was heartbreaking to hear that, actually, because I do think the government should be really honest about the levelling up agenda and mean it, because it's the right intent. We all believe it's in the right intent, and they therefore need to make sure their money, backs that intent. And obviously, we think that the North has a lot to offer. If you actually get all the cities of the North together, we work together as one. We know that combined, our economies can really accelerate and get rid of some of that deficit that obviously government is really grappling with. So it's about having a long-term plan. If you only invest in urgent care in hospitals, for example, you're never going to get ahead of that curve. You're never going to invest in making sure people have long-term healthy lives with good jobs that keep them well. And that's what we're in at the moment as a country. We need to make sure we get ahead of the urgent care, the urgent need in this country, so that people are able to be equipped to lead healthy, wealthy lives and can feed their children and have a good, successful life, which keeps them out of that urgent care, whether it's in hospitals or any other public services. It's really, we need a long-term vision. We have that in Bradford, and obviously I'm happy to talk to government about how we're going to work that in the north and of course in the rest of the country as Bradford's part. But we do need to think long-term, because this is a long-term ambition for all of us.
Now, I want to talk to you to end about children in Bradford, because child poverty in Bradford is the highest in Yorkshire. Figures from End Child Poverty show 50% of children in Bradford East, 51% in Bradford West, 42% in Bradford South are in poverty. Now, given that backdrop, your council's children's services were deemed to be inadequate, so bad in fact, the Education Secretary had to step in and take it away from the council. I mean, did you consider resigning over that?
We answered questions at the time around that, and obviously we take child safety and child safeguarding very seriously. We're pleased to be working with government to create a new Children's Trust. We've just appointed a chair and a chief executive who have got fantastic experience of turning things around. We're working really hard with them because we know that as a younger city, our children deserve the best, and we do believe that we've now got good people in place who can take it forward going forward, and we will work with them absolutely to make sure it's a success. There is nothing more important than getting things right for our children. As I said, we're the youngest city, that has to happen.
Do you take responsibility for what happened?
Absolutely, and I said that at the time and made obviously apologies on that regard as well. That is something that obviously stays with us, that we will never forget, and that we need to make sure we put right for the future of our children and of our prosperity of our district. Those young people growing up here today need to be the wealth creators of the future, and with rising child neglect and poverty, that is going to be an issue across the country to make sure that children stay with their families and lead healthy, wealthy lives. But we have a big part to play in that with the Trust going forward, and we want to create Bradford to be the best place in the country for children to grow up.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Great to talk to you about levelling up from Bradford. Looking very beautiful behind you, I have to say.
Thank you.
Well, that is it for this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday. In a moment, after the break, we're going to be running through today's interviews with our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Plus, do check out the podcast. That should be available around lunchtime with myself, Scott Beasley, my producer, and Liz Bates, our political correspondent. Thanks for joining us this Sunday morning. welcome back to Sophy Ridge on Sunday, The Take, where we take you back through the morning's interviews and we have some analysis for you from myself and our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, too. Well, it's been another remarkable week. I can't even believe it's all been in this week, to be honest. Another change of Prime Minister, another cabinet reshuffle. But, of course, the country's still facing a raft of difficult economic issues that I'm sure are going to really colour all of our political debates over the next few months. Well, we're joined by our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Good to have you with us, Sam, complete with your screen as well. Michael Gove this morning, I thought he was pretty upfront, actually, about a lot of things. It was quite one of those interviews where, he didn't really hold back. He started off by apologising for installing Liz Truss as Prime Minister.
That's right. Isn't it fascinating, Sophie? Actually, I suspect that we are going to hear disproportionately about Liz Truss's 49 days in power. Now, this government might say it wants to move on, but it also wants essentially to try and blame Liz Truss for absolutely every problem that they're now trying to fix, probably mostly fairly, some of which I suspect might raise some eyebrows. So whether it's the spending cuts to come, some of the challenges around different bits of the state, even when it comes to Northern Ireland, I think that there is just a sense that they want to communicate that they're mopping up Liz Truss's messes. That's what Rishi Sunak did when he stood on the steps of Downing Street on Tuesday. It's very much the tone of Michael Gove. And in a funny way, Sophie, it also strikes me that's the goal of the opposition as well. There is just a little bit of nervousness inside the Labour Party that Rishi Sunak will come across to the public as more sensible, as more competent, as somebody they can trust more. So they too are trying to talk up those 49 turbulent days of Liz Truss as a political tactic. So I don't think apologising by Michael Gove was a mistake at all. I think it's a large part of this new government's political tactic.
Have a quick listen to Michael Gove, shall we, before we go back to Sam. We talked to the Levelling Up Secretary about that resignation. Let's have a listen to what he said.
I think we made a mistake. We took the wrong turn. The mini-budget, as I think everyone now recognises, contained a number of false steps. I think it was wrong to cut taxes for the wealthiest, and it was also wrong to proceed with tax cuts without saying how they were going to be paid for. And to be fair, Jeremy Hunt, as Chancellor, as soon as he was installed, made clear that those mistakes would have to be addressed. And Rishi Sunak, as Prime Minister, of course, has been vindicated. Some of the judgments that he made during the course of the summer, during the course of the leadership election, have been shown to be correct. And Rishi now, along with Jeremy and the rest of us in government, have some difficult decisions to take. But what we must do is be honest with the British people in order to regain trust.
And Michael Gove there. Sam, I was quite interested when you were talking about how actually it's kind of in Rishi Sunak and his new cabinet's interest to blame everything on Liz Truss, because that's quite difficult to do, particularly when it comes to levelling up, right? They've had since 2019, so they've had 3 years to try and level up. When I was researching the interview for Michael Gove, there's an awful lot of evidence that actually things have got worse rather than better. If you look at the Bloomberg study, if you look at the IPPR research, then actually, particularly in those constituencies around England, in the north of England, in those areas outside London, things have been levelling down, if anything.
Absolutely. I think this tactic will work for a little bit. I mean, the last 49 days of Liz Truss were just an extraordinary roller coaster of turbulence. But in the end, I think if the Sunak government relied too much on pointing to Liz Truss's problems, then after a while the public will go, oh, come on, you were elected as a Conservative government under Boris Johnson in 2019. What about all the promises that you made then? But nevertheless, they will try. Very interesting that, as it were, the news announcement, I thought, the biggest news announcement this morning was Michael Gove saying, well, giving a pretty big hint that investment zones so conceived by Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng and Simon Clarke, the previous TROP trio, they've effectively very likely to be junked now. Those investment zones are areas where there could be low taxes, lower regulation in order to spur growth in particular parts of the country. Michael Gove said, look, I'm not particularly keen on them because I don't think that there are sufficient environmental protections. You could be concreting over protected land, you could be harming the environment in these zones. So I'm not terribly keen. So we're reviewing them, and it didn't pretty much sound like they were going to end up the other side of the sausage factory looking very much like they did at the moment. So that's one way that they can try and provide a firebreak, blame something in the levelling up agenda on Liz Truss. But you're right, when you look at all the metrics, all the problems, they were there and discussed during the leadership contest and therefore not there really during, not just caused by Liz Truss's time in power. But you look across the piece, and there are issues, and I think this is, I think in a moment what we're going to listen to next, there are issues a bit like the bigger levelling up problems and the investment challenges and the scenes on our high streets and crime. There are issues where ministers just can't escape some kind of broader mea culpa. And that's why the language from Michael Gove, cautious language around Brexit, was so fascinating this morning. Desperately trying to balance the positive with the negative. But just to hear one of the two main architects of the Brexit referendum in 2016 talk in the way that he did to you, I thought was quite striking. Previously, no element of Brexit tended to be recognised as a problem. But, you know, what he said to you this morning suggested that this government, at least, is moving to a slightly different approach.
Let's have a listen to that, shall we?
I think it's important to look at a big question like Brexit and to recognise that you can't make a snap judgment a few years later and say definitively that everything as a result of leaving the European Union has gone precisely in a perfect way. I think, on balance, Brexit has been a significant success for this country. But I do acknowledge that there have been frictions. And my friend Steve Baker, for example, acknowledged that as we resolve the situation in Northern Ireland, that some of the things that have been said and done haven't necessarily been perfectly pitched. I think that is an example of something that we need to address. But overall, I think we wouldn't have had the vaccine rollout that was so successful if we'd been within the European Union. And in an area for which I was previously responsible in the environment, we wouldn't have a better method of supporting farmers that strengthens the environment as well as enhancing food production if we were in the Common Agricultural Policy.
Michael Gove there talking about Brexit. And Sam, it's right, I was kind of fascinated by that interview as well and what he said. It came from a Financial Times interview that he did over in September, I think, so before he entered the cabinet, where, again, it was just quite fascinating. He's obviously wrestling still or thinking back still about Brexit. Was it as he expected? You know, have there been things that have gone wrong? And so that's why I really wanted to pose some of those rhetorical questions that he was asking to himself. And I think we did get a bit of an insight. Of course, he was very keen to say that on balance he thinks it's the right thing, but there was a hint of that reflection.
Absolutely, and Michael Gove is usually slightly less reflective in government than he is in those brief periods that he's had in the last 11 years out of the cabinet. And I also think you've just got that little sense of the real Michael Gove. I hate to say this, Sophie, but I think I get the impression at times that Michael Gove can be an incredibly tortured individual. He does grapple with difficult questions properly, dark nights of the soul. I think there is a sort of sense to him that he really thinks very deeply about stuff, and it's quite a journey for him making all the big decisions that he's made through his political career. And occasionally, like on the interview with you just now, you got a sense of that. But he touched on the fact that, of course, Brexit still has a relevance in day-to-day political life when it comes to Northern Ireland. And again this morning, that's another big problem for this government. The government looks as if it's about to call an election in Northern Ireland. I don't think we've quite had a date yet, which has raised some eyebrows amongst the Northern Ireland parties. But you heard from all sides of the spectrum on your show. And essentially, you have the unionists who are the most worried about the situation, effectively going, don't call an election, try and sort out or scrap the protocol. But it looks as if Rishi Sunak may break with the approach of Boris Johnson and the apparent approach of Liz Truss and actually try and prioritise some kind of negotiation with the EU over the kind of more bombastic, more aggressive approach that they've had. And I think you could see in Rishi Sunak's first week with his conversations with world leaders and the quite positive readouts you were getting from the French president and others, that tone is going down quite well, which will be necessary to solve, I think, one of the other biggest problems, which was to do with small boats and people traffickers taking people across the Channel to the UK. Now, that is understandably an issue, particularly with the latest revelations to do with the Manston Centre, that's quite live at the moment. But in the end, this is all part and parcel of the same question, whether or not a combative, robust approach, for instance, to the French government will help on this issue, and whether or not a slightly softer tone might help. And that's where Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, is caught in a storm that Labour really wants to highlight.
Thanks very much, Sam. We'll have more from you after the break in a short moment. We're going to be reflecting about Rishi Sunak's first week as Prime Minister. But I think certainly it's interesting because it feels to me like this is a week on the show we've been talking about policy, and that hasn't really happened for a while because of the crazy roller coaster we've been on with politics. So certainly it's been quite nice to kind of take a pause and talk a bit more about policy at a time, of course, of such critical juncture for the United Kingdom. More coming up in just a few moments.
These last few years have seen some huge stories. And these stories have been driven by politics, by politicians, the people in power.
You must stay at home.
And it's my job to figure out how these decisions made by politicians impact all of us in our everyday lives.
This is the worst thing I've ever been through in my life.
People turn up here with their child stuff in a black sack and just say, I don't want to.
And that is what it is. It's first-class poverty.
Is this an example of the welfare state failing?
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
These are stories that affect us all. Millions of children are now having to catch up. Some stories have changed all of our lives. Because like the residents, the staff are being infected. Politicians, they make decisions all of the time, and it's our job to hold them to account. I wonder if you will take this opportunity to apologise to those families. But in the end, the real power doesn't actually lie with the politicians. The real power lies with the people. I'm Nick Martin. I'm the People and Politics correspondent at Sky News.
Welcome back to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. The Take. We've been taking you back through some of the morning's interviews, mainly the Michael Gove one, the new Levelling Up Secretary. But now time perhaps to reflect on Rishi Sunak's first week as Prime Minister. We can bring Sam back in and have a little chat with him about what it's been like. It feels like, in a way, there's been so much build-up. Will he or won't he? Is he going to win? It doesn't feel like a surprise to see Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister, in a way. Have we learned anything new about him, do you think, in the last 5 days?
I mean, I think he's in an incredibly difficult situation. This is the job he fought for over the summer. he didn't win the leadership contest. The Conservative Party remains incredibly fractured. There is now an economic crisis led upon the political crisis, led upon the international crisis with the war in Ukraine. And I think that he now steps into Downing Street in a completely unenviable situation. But Sophie, look at this. This is the picture of the new modern British state, a new king barely weeks in the job, and they're Britain's first Asian Prime Minister. And that was something really celebrated, and it's remarkable. It was celebrated around the world, whether it was President Joe Biden, who talked about its global significance earlier this week, whether it was Narendra Modi, who clearly had a very warm phone call with Rishi Sunak this week, perhaps suggesting a bit more of a reset because there was some upset around amongst Indians about Liz Truss's plans on visas and the trade deal. So a reset with India. But just as an image of where we are compared to where we were, I think it's quite striking, and I think all of that just means that politics once again thrown up in the air, and we just don't yet know where all the cards are going to land.
Yeah, it was incredible, that image, wasn't it? One of several images, I guess, that I kind of feel have defined this week. In many ways. That one, I love that one that you're showing there of the new cabinet. I mean, I say new cabinet, there was quite a lot of familiar faces around that table, weren't there? I guess they're kind of refreshed, back to the future cabinet.
Absolutely. I mean, you can kind of have a look, resigned, forced to resign, once resigned, did resign. And I can go on all the way along, many of whom lost their jobs during Boris Johnson's time for one reason or another. So these are not new faces to our viewers, even if they're new faces, some of them around the cabinet table. What I thought about Rishi Sunak's cabinet appointments was, whilst he came in and the tone of a lot of his opening remarks reflected strength and contrition, I thought that the actual cabinet appointments were a little bit more defensive, because what he's doing is he's trying to balance the different factions around the cabinet table. So, I mean, that's, I think, why Suella Braverman is so important. She's sitting opposite the Prime Minister here. She represents the hard Brexiteers, a wing that he clearly doesn't want to upset. You've got people who've been perpetual critics of Rishi Sunak, like Andrew Mitchell, who has complained about the decision to cut aid prices. But then you've got reward for some of the people who were quite controversially involved in the ousting of Boris Johnson. There, smiling Mark Harper, he was one of the figures most robustly involved in the defenestration of Boris Johnson, sitting opposite Nadeem Zahawi, who for a 2-hour period last weekend, which is a lifetime ago, backed the return of Boris Johnson, saying Boris 2.0 was right for the country, and then quickly smelt the way that the wind was blowing and changed his mind. So a new cabinet for Rishi Sunak, reflecting the tensions inside the Conservative Party and the fact that however much Tory MPs might want to tell you that everything has changed, actually this is a party that's gone through so much along with the country since the December 2019 election. And
it really is, I guess, putting to the test that old adage that it's better to have people inside the tent. I mean, with that lot around inside the tent, I think it would be really interesting to see whether or not that plays out at all. Another defining image from the week there, Rishi Sunak at Diwali. I think that's one of my favourite photos of the week.
Yes, and as the first Hindu in Downing Street, there you see him at the Diwali celebration. I believe that's in Downing Street. I believe that was on Wednesday, just before your 9 o'clock show this week. And this is just not something that we've seen before. Arguably one of the most passionate people of faith that we've had in Downing Street in some time. David Cameron might have talked about his faith going in and out of the a little bit like the radio signal in the Chilterns, but I think nobody doubts the sincerity of Rishi Sunak when it comes to his faith, and I think that just provides a sort of counterpoint to a lot of what we've seen. It's an interesting, different approach in a country where the monarch is the defender of the Church of England. So interesting. It's just an interesting new development in the way that our state wins. But then some old challenges as well. This was Friday. You had Rishi Sunak down at a hospital visit in the south of England, and he was accosted by a patient, making this exchange made many of the front pages. And I think this is the kind of politics as normal that we might be back to. But it's the NHS, I think, that he recognises, he's signalled that he recognises is going to really dominate quite a lot of people's views about his government at a time where, yes, they might be able to keep the kind of the ring fence, in other words, keep their commitment that the NHS budget should grow, but with all of the inflationary pressures, with the fact that everything, including for the NHS, for doctors and nurses and NHS managers, costs a lot more, the NHS will have to do more with less, and that's potentially going to result in more exchanges like this one. So that's what kind of politics as normal looks like. That's you know, none of this ahead of the spending statement in about, what is it, 2.5, 3 weeks' time is going to be made easier. None of this is going to be made easier by the hugely difficult decisions and the £50 billion of cuts that his government and this man is going to have to make.
Yeah, that really is the big challenge, isn't it, for Rishi Sunak's premiership, the defining challenge. Sam, thanks for talking through those images. It's lovely to see them. I just want to finish by having a little listen to a bit of the end of my Michael Gove interview, because I think this actually did give us a bit of an insight into Rishi Sunak as well, because Michael Gove has been there for many, many different PMQs prep for different leaders, David Cameron, Boris Johnson, most recently Rishi Sunak. So I thought he might have a bit of insight into, you know, how Rishi Sunak prepares for those moments of maximum stress.
I know that when Boris was Prime Minister, he liked to have one of the team in Number 10 play Keir Starmer, and so there were two particular aides who at different times played Keir Starmer. Rishi likes to look at it issue by issue by issue in a very methodical way.
Does someone play Keir Starmer for Rishi Sunak as well?
There is one incredibly bright person who ran through the questions that Keir Starmer might run. I will spare the blushes of that person, simply to say that she's one of the smartest people I've ever worked with.
OK, very interesting to know that. You've had a bit of a comeback as well, haven't you? Were you expecting to be back in Cabinet?
No.
Does this mean we're going to be seeing a bit less of you in the nightclubs?
Yes.
I love those direct answers from Michael Gove. The yes or no's, they're my favourites, I think. Sam?
Yeah, he is one of the most colourful figures in Cabinet, but colourful isn't actually what this government wants to do. They want to do boring and sensible. They've pulled all their business for this week to try and calm things down. But given the challenges, will Rishi Sunak succeed?
Yeah, that is the big question. Sam, thank you very much indeed. A serious government from Rishi Sunak, that's what he wants to project, and I think that's why perhaps we might be seeing a few more appearances by people like Michael Gove, people they see as serious big hitters on programmes like this one. That is it from Sophy Ridge on Sunday The Take. Have a lovely rest of your weekend. And do remember, check out the podcast. That should be available around lunchtime, wherever you normally get your podcast. We're going to be digesting some of those interviews and trying to work out what we learned. See you next Sunday.